Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, 1828 to 1905. Chapter 11. Phileas Fogg gets an unusual mode of transportation at an incredible price. The train left right on time. Among the passengers were several officers, government officials, and merchants heading to the eastern coast. Passepartout sat in the same carriage as his master, Phileas Fogg, while Sir Francis Cromarty, one of Fogg's whist partners from the Mongolia, took the seat across from them. Sir Francis was a tall, fair-haired man of about 50 who had earned a reputation for his bravery during the recent Sepoy Rebellion. He had made India his home, visiting England only occasionally, and was very familiar with Indian culture and history. Phileas Fogg, however, wasn't interested in these details. He was focused on his own precise schedule, calculating the hours since his departure from London. Sir Francis noted how odd Fogg seemed and wondered whether there was any warmth or appreciation for the beauty of nature behind Fogg's seemingly cold exterior. The Brigadier General couldn't help but think that, of all the unusual people he had met, Fogg was the most remarkable, thanks to his strict devotion to the principles of the exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had told Sir Francis about his plan to travel around the world and the bet that prompted his journey. Sir Francis thought the bet was foolish and a sign of poor judgment. He believed that if Fogg continued this way, he would end up achieving nothing beneficial for himself or anyone else. About an hour after leaving Bombay, the train had crossed the bridges and the island of Salsette, entering open countryside. At Kalyan, they reached the junction of the branch line heading toward southeastern India, passing through Kandala and Poona. As they traveled through the mountain passes with their basalt bases and forested peaks, Fogg and Sir Francis occasionally exchanged words. Sir Francis remarked, "A few years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have faced a delay at this point that could have cost you your bet." "How so, Sir Francis?" "Because the railway used to stop at the base of these mountains. Passengers had to cross them in carriages or on ponies to reach Kandahara on the other side." "Such a delay wouldn't have affected my plans at all," said Mr. Fogg. "I've always anticipated possible obstacles." "But, Mr. Fogg," continued Sir Francis, "you risk running into trouble because your servants adventure at the pagoda." Passepartout, with his feet comfortably wrapped in his travel blanket, was fast asleep and unaware that he was being talked about. "The government is very strict about that kind of offense. They ensure the religious customs of the Indians are respected, and if your servant were caught—" "Very well, Sir Francis," replied Mr. Fogg. "If he had been caught, he would have been punished and then quietly returned to Europe. I don't see how this would have delayed me." The conversation ended there. During the night, the train left the mountains and passed Nasik. The next day it traveled through the flat, well-cultivated land of Khandesh, with its scattered villages and towers of pagodas rising above them. This fertile area is watered by many small rivers and clear streams, mostly branches of the god of Veri. When Passepartout woke up and looked outside, he could hardly believe he was crossing India by train. The locomotive, driven by an English engineer and powered by English coal, sent smoke swirling over cotton, coffee, nutmeg, clove, and pepper plantations. Then they traveled through vast plains extending to the horizon with jungles inhabited by snakes and tigers that fled from the noise of this train. Next they entered forests, still home to elephants that watched the train pass with thoughtful eyes. At 12:30 the train stopped at Burhampur, where Passepartout bought some Indian slippers, decorated with fake pearls. Proudly he put them on and showed off his new purchase. The travelers had a quick breakfast and set off for Asirgarh briefly, following the banks of the small Tapti River, which flows into the Gulf of Cambrai near Surat. Passepartout was lost in deep thought. Before arriving in Bombay, he had hoped their journey would end there. But now that they were speeding across India, his outlook changed dramatically. He began to take his master's project seriously, believing in the reality of the bet and the need to complete the journey within the set time. He started to worry about the potential delays and accidents. He felt personally involved in the bet and was anxious at the thought that his own carelessness the night before might cause them to lose. Unlike Mr. Fogg, who remained calm, Passepartout was anxious and constantly checked the time, cursing whenever the train stopped and blaming it for being slow. The train entered the Sutpur Mountains towards evening. The next day, Sir Francis Cromarty asked Passepartout what time it was. Passepartout checked his watch and said it was 3 a.m. However, because his watch was set to Greenwich Mean Time, and they were now about 77 degrees west of Greenwich, it was actually about 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time and pointed out that the watch should be adjusted for each new time zone they crossed as they were moving eastward. This meant that the days were getting shorter by 4 minutes for every degree traveled. Passepartout stubbornly refused to adjust his watch, insisting on keeping it set to London time. He thought it was a harmless mistake that wouldn't cause any problems. The train stopped at 8 o'clock in a clearing about 15 miles beyond Rothal, where there were a few bungalows and workmen's cabins. The conductor walked down the aisles shouting, "Passengers will get out here." Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty for an explanation, but the general didn't know why they had stopped in the middle of this forest of date palms and acacias. Passepartout, equally puzzled, rushed outside and quickly came back saying, "Monsieur, the train isn't going any further." "What do you mean?" asked Sir Francis. "I mean the train isn't continuing," Passepartout explained. The general immediately got off the train and Phileas Fogg followed him calmly. Together they went to speak with the conductor. Chapter 12. Phileas Fogg and his friends crossed the Indian forest, and what happened? To make the trip shorter, the guide took a route to the left of the railway that was still under construction. The railway couldn't go straight because of the winding Vindhya Mountains. The Parsee guide, who knew the area well, said they could save 20 miles by going straight through the forest. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, seated in special seats on the elephant, were jolted terribly by the elephant's fast pace. Urged on by the skilled Parsee, they handled the discomfort calmly, speaking little and barely able to see each other. Passepartout, riding on the elephant's back, felt every bump. Following his master's advice, he was careful to keep his tongue in check to avoid biting it. He bounced around like a circus performer, but laughed through it all. Occasionally, he took a piece of sugar from his pocket and gave it to Keone, the elephant, who accepted it without slowing down. After 2 hours, the guide stopped the elephant and let him rest for an hour. During this time, Keone drank from a nearby spring and then started eating the branches and shrubs around him. Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg didn't mind the break and felt relieved to get off. "He's like iron," said the general, admiring Keone. "Like forged iron," added Passepartout as he quickly prepared breakfast. At noon, the Parsee signaled it was time to go. The scenery became wild and rugged. Groves of date palms and dwarf palms replaced the dense forests, followed by vast dry plains with scattered shrubs and large rocks. The English haven't fully controlled this area, which is influenced by Rajas, who are hard to reach in their mountain fortresses. The Parsee tried to avoid them. Despite his cheerful mood, one thought bothered Passepartout. What would Mr. Fogg do with the elephant when they reached Allahabad? Would he take the elephant with him? That seemed impossible, as it would be too expensive. Would he sell it or set it free? By 8 in the evening they had crossed the main chain of the Vindhya Mountains and stopped at a ruined bungalow on the northern slope. They had traveled almost 25 miles that day and still had the same distance to go to reach Allahabad station. The night was cold. The Parsee lit a fire in the bungalow with some dry branches, and the warmth was very welcome. They used the food they bought in Colby for supper and ate hungrily. After a few brief conversations, they soon fell asleep, snoring loudly. The guide watched over Keone, who slept standing up, leaning against a large tree. Nothing happened during the night to wake them, although they occasionally heard panthers growling and monkeys chattering. The more dangerous animals stayed quiet and didn't bother them. Sir Francis slept soundly like a tired soldier. Passepartout had restless dreams about the bumpy ride from the day before. Mr. Fogg slept peacefully, as if he were back in his calm home on Savile Row. They started their journey again at 6 in the morning. The guide hoped to reach Allahabad by evening. If they did, Mr. Fogg would only lose a small part of the 48 hours he had saved since the start of the trip. Keone moved quickly, soon descending the lower slopes of the Vindhya Mountains. Around noon, they passed the village of Kalinger by the Kani River, a branch of the Ganges. The guide avoided villages, thinking it was safer to stay in the open country along the edges of the river basin. Allahabad was now only 12 miles to the northeast. They stopped under a bunch of banana trees and enjoyed the fruit, which was as healthy as bread and as tasty as cream. At 2 o'clock, the guide entered a thick forest that stretched for miles. He preferred to travel through the woods for cover. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the elephant suddenly became restless and stopped. It was now 4 o'clock. "What's wrong?" asked Sir Francis, sticking his head out. "I'm not sure, officer," replied the Parsee, listening carefully to a distant noise coming through the trees. The noise grew clear and sounded like a mix of human voices and brass instruments. Passepartout was alert, and Mr. Fogg waited quietly. The Parsee got off the elephant, tied it to a tree, and went into the forest. He quickly came back and said, "A procession of vermins is coming this way. We need to hide if we can." The guide released the elephant and led him into a dense thicket, asking the travelers to stay still. He stayed ready to mount the elephant quickly if they needed to escape, but he hoped the procession would pass without noticing them hidden in the thick foliage. The sound of voices and instruments grew louder. Soon the head of the procession appeared under the trees about 100 paces away. Through the branches they could see the religious figures clearly. First came the priests wearing mitres and long lace robes. They were followed by men, women, and children singing a mournful hymn interrupted by the beat of tambourines and cymbals. Behind them was a large cart. On the cart, drawn by 4 richly adorned oxen, stood a terrifying statue with 4 arms, a dull red body, wild eyes, messy hair, a protruding tongue, and lips colored with betel. The statue stood on top of a laying down and headless giant. Sir Francis recognized the statue and whispered, "That's Kali, the goddess of love and death." "Death, maybe," Passepartout whispered back, "but love? That ugly old woman? No way." The Parsee signaled them to be quiet. A group of old fakirs were dancing wildly around the statue. Following them were some Brahmins dressed in elaborate traditional clothing, leading a young woman who stumbled with each step. She was as fair as a European, and her head, neck, shoulders, ears, arms, hands, and toes were covered in jewels and gems. She wore a gold-bordered dress and a light muslin robe that revealed her figure. The guards with the young woman were very different. They had bare swords at their waists and fancy pistols. They were also carrying a body on a platform. The body was of an old man dressed as a Rajah, wearing a turban with pearls, a silk and gold robe, a cashmere scarf with diamonds, and the fine weapons of a Hindu prince. Sir Francis watched the procession with a sad look and said to the guide, "That's a suttee." The guide nodded and signaled for silence. The procession slowly moved through the trees, and soon it disappeared into the forest. The music and singing faded away, and eventually all was quiet again. Phileas Fogg, having overheard Sir Francis, asked, "What is a suttee?" "A suttee," replied Sir Francis, "is a voluntary human sacrifice. The woman you just saw will be burned tomorrow at dawn." "Oh, that's terrible," Passepartout exclaimed, unable to hide his anger. "And the body?" Mr. Fogg asked. "It's the body of the prince, her husband," the guide said. "He was an independent Rajah from Bundelkund." "Is it true," Phileas Fogg said, sounding calm, "that these brutal customs still exist in India, and that the English haven't been able to stop them?" "These sacrifices don't happen in most of India," Sir Francis explained, "but we have no control over these wild areas, especially in Bundelkund." The whole region north of the Vindhyas is a place of constant violence and theft. The poor woman, Passepartout said, to be burned alive? Yes, Sir Francis replied, burned alive. And if she wasn't, her relatives would treat her horribly. Sometimes, though, the sacrifice is truly voluntary, and the government has to step in to stop it. As Sir Francis spoke, the guide shook his head and said, "The sacrifice tomorrow at dawn is not voluntary." "How do you know?" "Everyone knows about this in Bundelkund." "But the poor woman didn't seem to resist," Sir Francis noted. "That's because they drugged her with cannabis and opium fumes." "But where are they taking her?" "To the Pilaji Pagoda 2 miles from here. She'll spend the night there, and the sacrifice will happen tomorrow at dawn." The guide then led the elephant out of the thicket and climbed onto its back. Just as he was about to signal Keone to move, Mr. Fogg stopped him and said to Sir Francis, "Let's save this woman." "Save the woman, Mr. Fogg? I have 12 hours to spare. I can use them to help her." "You're a man of compassion." "Sometimes," replied Phileas Fogg quietly, "when I have the time."